The rain had not stopped for 3 days. It drummed softly on the wooden roof of the small cottage, the same way it had on Lila's heart since her father's words had fallen like stones in their tiny kitchen. "You will marry Lord Corwin." Lila had stared at him then, wide-eyed, unable to speak. It was not a request. It was a verdict, handed down not by a father but by a man broken by debt and shame. Old gambling debts, whispered trades gone wrong, and foolish pride had left him with nothing but a daughter he could barter. Outside, the muddy streets of their village churned with water. Inside, Lila's hands trembled as she packed what little she owned, a threadbare shawl, a comb of carved wood, her mother's old locket, into a small sack. The marriage contract had been signed. The dowry, what was left of the family land, was gone. In return, her father's life would be spared, the creditors kept at bay. But at what cost? Lord Corwin was a nobleman of some repute, once known for his wisdom and command. But that was years ago. Now he was old, some said near 70, with a frail body racked by an unnamed illness. Rumors whispered that he would not last the month. His estate, vast but crumbling, stood beyond the forest on the hill, a cold, grey house shadowed by gossip. No one knew why a man so near death wanted a young bride. Lila had asked her father once, her voice sharp with desperation. He had avoided her gaze. "He has no heir," he said. "The marriage gives him dignity, perhaps. You will be cared for. He will not last long." No one had cared to ask what Lila wanted. No one thought it mattered. On the morning of her departure, the sky remained dull and heavy. Her father watched her from the door as she climbed into the old carriage sent from the estate. The coachman, a grim-faced man in a worn black coat, gave her no greeting. The horses stirred impatiently, their breath rising in the cold air. Lila did not look back. Bitterness rose in her throat, but she swallowed it. There was no room for tears, not now. If this was to be her fate, she would face it with eyes open. The ride to Lord Corwin's estate seemed endless. The road wound through misty woods, bare branches scraping the sides of the carriage like skeletal fingers. The deeper they went, the quieter it grew, as if even the birds had no wish to sing here. Finally, as dusk began to fall, the trees parted to reveal the house. It stood atop a rise, its dark stone walls streaked with moss and age. Narrow windows stared out like watchful eyes. The iron gates creaked open and the carriage rolled through. Servants in dull gray livery waited at the steps, their faces pale and expressionless. Lila stepped down, the weight of her new life pressing on her shoulders. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and forgotten rooms. The halls were long and dim, hung with faded tapestries. Footsteps echoed strangely. No warmth greeted her. A woman introduced as Madame Brea, the housekeeper, led her to her chambers. "You will dine with the master in an hour," she said, her tone neither kind nor cold, merely factual. The room assigned to Lila was large, its bed draped in heavy curtains. A single window looked out over a dying garden. She set her small bag on the bed and sat beside it, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her heart ached with a mixture of fear and resentment. An hour later, dressed in a plain gown left for her by the servants, she followed Madame Brea through the silent halls to the dining room. Lord Corwin was already seated at the head of the long table. He was not what she had imagined. Though thin and pale, his face retained a certain dignity, sharp cheekbones, clear gray eyes that held intelligence and a glimmer of humor. His hair was white, his hands frail. But there was no cruelty in his gaze. He looked at her quietly for a moment before speaking. "You are Lila." She inclined her head, her voice caught in her throat. "Yes, my lord." He smiled faintly. "There is no need to call me lord here. Corwin will do. I regret the terms of this arrangement. But know this, no harm will come to you in this house." Lila met his eyes, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. Still, bitterness prickled within her. "I am here because I must be," she said softly. "Not by choice." A shadow passed across Corwin's face, but he nodded. "As am I," he said simply. They dined in silence, save for the occasional clink of silverware. Servants moved like wraiths, silent and efficient. When the meal ended, Corwin rose with effort and offered her his arm, a gesture of courtesy rather than necessity. He led her to a small sitting room where a fire burned low. "You may go where you wish in this house," he said. "There are rooms you will find locked. They are of no consequence to you. You will be left to your own comfort." Lila, unsure of what to say, nodded. The air between them hung heavy with unspoken things. That night, alone in her chamber, Lila lay awake long after the candles burned low. The rain had begun again, tapping softly at the window. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts a tangled web of sorrow and defiance. She had not asked for this life. She had not wanted to be bound to a dying man in a house of shadows. And yet, something in Corwin's eyes unsettled her. A kindness, perhaps, or a sadness deeper than her own. It was a puzzle she could not solve. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the scent of distant storms. Lila turned on her side, clutching the old locket beneath her pillow. Tomorrow she would wake in this strange house again. Tomorrow her life in chains would begin. But in her heart, one thought remained clear. If she must endure this fate, she would not let it break her. Not yet. The next night she asked him about a faded map on the library wall. He told her of forgotten kingdoms, of long-dead kings and lost knowledge. And so, between the silences, a fragile thread of understanding began to weave between them. Still, the house remained cold in spirit. The servants remained distant. And Lila's heart still yearned for the life that had been stolen from her. Often she would sit at the tall window in her chamber, gazing toward the forested hills beyond. Somewhere out there lay freedom, though it seemed beyond reach. Her world had become this lonely house, its walls both protection and prison. And yet, each time she spoke with Corwin, some small part of her thawed. There was no cruelty in him. No desire to possess or harm. He carried his own sorrow, his own regrets. One night, as she prepared to leave the library, Corwin spoke. "Lila," he said quietly, "you are young. You should not be bound to a place such as this. I regret what necessity has forced upon you." She turned, surprised by the pain in his voice. "I did not choose this life either," he continued. "But if there is any comfort I can offer you within my remaining days, know that I will try." For the first time, Lila felt a flicker of something unexpected. Not love, not friendship, but a shared understanding between two trapped souls. She nodded, her voice soft. "Thank you." And as she returned to her cold chamber that night, the wind howling beyond the glass, Lila knew this truth. She was still a prisoner. Her life was still not her own. But perhaps, in this house of shadows, there was a chance to find some sliver of meaning, before fate took it all away. The days turned colder as autumn deepened. Mornings brought mist that curled around the garden's withered branches, and evenings arrived early, shadows stretching long through the halls. Lila kept to her quiet routines, her steps now familiar on the stone floors of the estate. Each morning she woke in the same bed, ate the same solitary meal, wandered the same overgrown gardens, and at night answered the occasional summons to the library. It was during these evenings that something began to shift. At first, their conversations had been spare, polite, an exchange of basic courtesies and little more. Lila's wariness remained intact, the walls around her heart unyielding. Corwin, for his part, asked no prying questions. He treated her with a reserved gentleness, his voice soft but steady despite the tremor in his hands. There was no hint of possessiveness or demand in him, only a calm presence. One rainy evening, with wind rattling the windows and the fire burning low, Lila arrived in the library to find Corwin not in his usual chair but by the window, gazing out at the storm. When he heard her enter, he spoke without turning. "It reminds me of the sea," he said quietly. "Endless and wild. I have not seen it in many years." Lila paused, curious despite herself. "You have traveled?" A faint smile touched his lips as he slowly lowered himself back into the chair by the fire. "In my youth, long before illness made me a prisoner of this place. There was a time when I thought the world had no edge I could not reach." He gestured toward a tall bookcase. "There is a journal there, the red-bound one. If you would bring it." Lila hesitated, then crossed the room and found the book he spoke of. She handed it to him, her fingers brushing his briefly. His skin was cool, his grip light. Opening the journal with care, Corwin turned the pages, their edges yellowed with age. He read aloud passages from years past, of distant ports, glittering cities, strange markets filled with scents and colors he could still recall in vivid detail. Lila listened, drawn in despite her guarded heart. In his voice she heard not the frailty of a dying man, but the echo of someone who had once lived boldly, who had known a world far beyond these stone walls. After that night she began to look forward, though she would not admit it, to these small encounters. Sometimes Corwin would tell her of ancient legends or forgotten histories. Other nights he would ask her simple questions about her childhood, her favorite flowers, the places she used to dream of seeing. He never pressed when she gave short answers, never sought more than she was willing to give. It was this gentle respect that slowly eroded the bitterness that had first filled her. She began to answer more freely, to ask him questions in turn. Their exchanges, though quiet, began to feel like a thread of connection in the vast emptiness of the estate. One afternoon, while walking in the garden, Lila came across an old sundial half buried in ivy. The stone was cracked, the inscription worn. That evening she mentioned it to Corwin. "It was my mother's favorite place," he told her. "She loved the garden. In spring it would burst with color. It has been years since anyone tended it." The next morning, with no summons expected, Lila found herself drawn back to the sundial. She cleared the ivy from its base, her fingers working carefully to reveal the worn carvings beneath. The simple act brought her a strange sense of peace. That night, when Corwin asked how she had spent her day, Lila told him. "I think your mother would be pleased," he said softly, and for the first time, his smile reached his eyes. Days passed, and with them came more small exchanges, more quiet moments of understanding. Lila found herself lingering longer in the library. The conversations grew deeper. She learned of Corwin's lost siblings, of friendships faded with time, of joys once savored and regrets carried like stones. In turn, Lila spoke of her mother, long dead, and of the simple joys of her old life. She spoke of running barefoot through wildflowers, of the stories her mother once told by candlelight. There was sadness in her words, but also warmth. Through these exchanges, the bond between them, so fragile at first, began to strengthen. One cold evening, as snow drifted softly past the windows, Corwin asked her, "Do you still dream of freedom?" The question, though softly spoken, struck deep. Lila looked down at her hands. "Every day." He nodded, understanding. "As do I," he said. "Though mine is a different kind of prison." There was no self-pity in his voice, only quiet resignation. And in that moment, Lila saw him not as the dying man she had been forced to marry, but as another soul caught in chains not of his making. Without thinking, she spoke. "When the snow melts, will you let me plant something in the garden?" He looked at her, surprised. Then, with a faint smile, he replied, "You may plant whatever you wish." A promise, small, but it felt like a breath of life in the stillness of the house. That night, Lila lay awake beneath her heavy covers, the fire in her hearth burning low. The loneliness that had weighed on her heart since the day of her marriage had not vanished, but something else now lived alongside it, the fragile beginnings of trust. She did not yet call it friendship. The word felt too bold, too dangerous. But as the winter winds howled beyond the stone walls, Lila knew this. In this cold and lonely house, a silent bond had begun to grow. And for the first time since her life had been sold, she allowed herself to hope, if only a little. Winter's grip tightened around the estate. Snow drifted in high against the stone walls, muffling sound and isolating the house even further from the world beyond. The garden lay silent beneath a thick blanket of white, branches bowed beneath their frozen burden. Inside, the fires burned longer, but the cold crept in through every crack and seam. And in the library, where a dim flame flickered in the hearth, Corwin's strength waned. Lila saw it in his eyes, in the pallor of his skin, the way his hands trembled more with each passing day. The voice that once told her stories now came thin and labored, every word an effort. Yet he still greeted her with that faint smile whenever she entered the room. Each day she stayed a little longer, drawn by something beyond duty or pity, a genuine care that had taken root against her will. The servants seemed to sense what was coming. Their movements grew quieter, their glances more solemn. Even Madame Brea, always composed, carried a shadow in her gaze. Lila began spending more hours by Corwin's side. She would read softly from old books while he rested, her voice filling the room where his once had. Sometimes he drifted to sleep mid-sentence, and she would watch him, her heart aching with a strange mixture of sadness and compassion. One bitter night, as winds howled beyond the windows and the snow piled higher, Brea found her in the hallway. "He will not last many more days," the housekeeper said gently. "He has asked for you." Lila followed her to the master's chambers, a room she had never entered before. It was grand but somber, the heavy bed draped in dark velvet. Corwin lay propped among cushions, his breathing shallow, his face drawn and pale. When she stepped closer, he opened his eyes and motioned weakly for her to sit. She took the chair beside him, her hands folded in her lap, uncertain what to say. For a long moment, Corwin seemed content simply to look at her, as though memorizing the face of the one soul who had offered him honest company in these last weeks. Then with great effort he spoke. "I have little time, Lila," he whispered, his voice dry and cracked. "And there are things I must tell you." She leaned closer, her breath caught. "This house, this title, all of it, has enemies," he murmured. "Jealous men. Ambitious cousins. When I was strong they could not touch me. But now, they wait for my death." He paused, gathering strength. There are debts owed. Secrets buried. I have tried to shield you from it all. But once I am gone, they will come. Lila's heart pounded. The words felt heavy with unseen weight. Why tell me this? She asked softly. Because you are not weak, Corwin whispered, his gaze steady. You are clever and brave. They will underestimate you as they did me once. But listen, he coughed, wincing. There is a ledger. Hidden behind the library's western shelf. Names, dates, proof. Guard it well. She nodded, her throat tight. I will. For a moment he closed his eyes, breath shallow. Lila feared he had drifted away. But then with one last effort his voice returned, barely audible. And, forgive me, Lila, he whispered, for binding you to this life. It was not what I wished, only what necessity forced. Tears stung her eyes. Whatever bitterness she had once held had faded. In this moment, watching this proud man fade before her, all that remained was sorrow. I forgive you, she whispered. A faint smile touched his lips, the barest flicker of peace. Through the long hours of that night, she remained by his side. The storm raged on beyond the windows, wind shrieking through the eaves. The servants came and went in silence, their faces drawn. As dawn neared, Corwin drifted in and out of restless sleep. At times he spoke softly, fragments of memory and regret slipping from his lips. Lila held his hand, her presence the only anchor in that dim room. In those final hours, something deeper than friendship bound them, a fragile trust born not of circumstance but of shared truth. And when at last the first pale light crept over the horizon, and Corwin's breath grew still, Lila closed her eyes and whispered a silent farewell. She sat with him until the house stirred to life. Madame Brea entered with solemn steps, her eyes wet. The servants followed, bowing their heads in respect. Later, as the house filled with the low murmur of preparations for morning, Lila withdrew to the library. The words Corwin had left her weighed heavy in her mind. Behind the western shelf, just as he had said, she found the hidden ledger. Its leather cover was old, its pages filled with names, debts, alliances, a web of intrigue that stretched through the noble courts. She traced the writing with trembling fingers, understanding now the storm that would soon descend. Enemies would come. Dangers she had never imagined awaited her. But sitting alone in that dim room, her heart still heavy with grief, Lila knew one thing with certainty. She would face them. For herself. For the man who had trusted her in the end. And for the life that still lay ahead, uncertain but her own. The room had grown deathly still. Only the soft crackle of the fire remained, and even that seemed quieter now, subdued beneath the gravity of what had just passed. Corwin lay motionless, his pallor ashen against the pillows. Lila sat at his side, her hand resting over his, her fingers chilled from the long night. The breath she waited for did not come again. His chest remained still. Yet even in those last fragile moments as his spirit lingered on the edge of darkness, Corwin's lips had moved, a faint whisper, barely more than breath. Lila had leaned in, drawn by instinct, straining to hear what might be his final words. And then, in a voice dry as autumn leaves, 2 syllables escaped. Alaric. Lila froze. For a heartbeat, the world itself seemed to stop. Alaric. Her father. She drew back slightly, eyes wide, her own breath caught in her throat. Had she heard it right? Could it have been some other word, some half-spoken name? But no, even as the firelight flickered across the worn features of the man beside her, she knew with a terrible certainty what she had heard. Alaric. Her father's name. A man long thought honorable. A man she had loved and admired her entire life, even after his death. The only parent she had known. Her memories of him were gilded with warmth. His laughter, the way he had once lifted her high when she was small, the gentle way he had stroked her hair when she was sick. And now this. A name spoken with a weight of betrayal. The final breath of a dying man, carrying more meaning than 1,000 words. Lila's heart pounded in her chest. Her mind reeled, trying to grasp what it could mean. Her father, involved in Corwin's ruin? The same ruin that had led to this forced marriage, this cold house, this life she had never wanted? She stood abruptly, knocking over the small chair beside the bed. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. The walls seemed to close in on her. No, it couldn't be true. And yet, why would Corwin speak that name with that tone in that moment? The room blurred. Lila gripped the edge of the heavy curtains to steady herself. Her father, gone these 3 years, had always been a man of dignity. A merchant of repute, respected in court and town alike. But Corwin had whispered his name with bitterness, with grief, as if her father's hand had shaped the ruin of his house. Her gaze drifted to the small ledger now hidden in her chambers, the one Corwin had led her to. Was the proof inside? Was her father's name among those debts, those alliances, those old betrayals? She needed to know. Yet a part of her recoiled. If it were true, if her father had truly betrayed Corwin, what did that make her? What lies had she lived beneath, believing herself a daughter of an honorable man? She stumbled from the room, down the cold stone corridors, her mind spinning. The servants parted wordlessly, eyes lowered in grief. Somewhere she heard Brea's voice murmuring to one of them, but the words didn't reach her. She fled to her chambers, slamming the door behind her. The ledger waited in the locked chest beneath her bed. Her hands trembled as she retrieved it, the worn leather now seeming heavier, darker. For long moments she simply stared at it, terrified of what she might find. Finally, with a shaking breath, she opened the book. Names, dates, transactions. Notes written in Corwin's firm hand. Some were long-forgotten lords, some still held power in court. And then, 3/4 through the pages, a familiar name stared back at her. Alaric Valen. Her father. The entry was brief but damning. Alaric Valen, 10,000 crowns paid under duress. Information sold regarding House Trinault holdings. Resulting in loss of trade routes and standing in court. Trust broken. Debt unpaid. Lila's breath caught. Her hands trembled harder. Information sold? To whom? And for what purpose? She flipped back, reading the earlier entries, piecing together the timeline. It was clear. In the years before Corwin's illness, when his house had still prospered, someone had begun moving against him. Rival merchants. Lesser nobles eager to climb higher. And among the agents they used, her father. She could hardly breathe. Memories rose unbidden. The year her father had returned from a long journey, pale and withdrawn. The sudden shift in their fortunes, his newfound wealth. She had never questioned it. She had been too young, too happy to see her father smile again. But now she saw it for what it was. Blood money. She closed the ledger, pressing her hands hard against its cover as though to still her racing heart. Corwin had known. And with his final breath, he had given her the truth. It wasn't just grief that had forced this marriage, it was reparation. Her father's betrayal had been part of the ruin that had brought House Trinault low, forcing Corwin into weakness, forcing him to bind himself to another house through marriage. Through her. And now Corwin was dead. And Lila was trapped in a web she had never seen until it was too late. Her knees buckled. She sank to the floor, the cold stone unforgiving beneath her. Had her father meant to save their family or simply himself? Had he known what the consequences would be? She would never know. He had died with his secrets intact. But now she carried the weight of them. How would the court see her if this truth emerged? A traitor's daughter. The wife of a dead noble with no allies and no power. Already dangers circled. She thought of Corwin's enemies, the ones he had warned her of. They would come soon. And if they learned of her father's part, they would tear her apart. But beneath the shock and grief, something else stirred in Lila's heart, resolve. She would not run. She would not let their machinations destroy her. Not after everything. Corwin had trusted her with the truth. It was now her burden, her weapon, her shield. Somehow she would survive what was coming. She would find a way to reshape her fate, no longer the pawn of her father's mistakes or the court's cruelty. She rose slowly, wiping her tears. There was no time to grieve. No time to fall apart. The storm had already begun. And Lila would meet it, with eyes wide open. Sleep eluded Lila. Long after the house had gone still, with the mourners withdrawn and the servants locked in their quarters, she lay awake beneath heavy covers, her mind spinning with the weight of Corwin's final whisper. Her father. She could not reconcile it. The man who had raised her with such kindness, whose lessons on honesty and honor had shaped her very soul, now branded as betrayer in the final words of a dying man. And yet the ledger did not lie. That single entry was too precise, too deliberate to dismiss. And worse still was the tone in Corwin's voice, etched with grief and bitterness. She needed to know more, had to know more. To understand what had truly passed between her father and this house, to uncover the path that had led her here, forced into a life of shadows. By first light her decision was made. If the truth existed she would find it. The library became her refuge. Hour after hour she combed through ledgers, correspondence and faded scrolls, searching for any link between Alaric Valen and the slow ruin of House Trinault. At first the search seemed hopeless. Corwin's papers were neatly kept but sparse on personal matters. The servants had long grown used to the house's cold decline, and few paid attention to records of the past. But Lila persisted. She questioned Brea carefully, probing beneath the housekeeper's stoic mask. After much gentle urging, Brea reluctantly revealed an old key, once belonging to Corwin's late steward, a key to the long-forgotten vault beneath the west wing. They sealed it after the steward's death, Brea said quietly. His records were too painful for the master. He could not bear to face the past. Lila's heart pounded as she took the heavy iron key. That vault might hold what Corwin had not been able to confront, what she must confront now. The door yielded with a long groan, dust billowing out as hinges unused for years gave way. Inside lay rows of old crates and shelves, scrolls and books wrapped in oilskin untouched by time. It was here in this forgotten room that Lila found what she sought, a box marked with her father's seal. Her hands shook as she opened it. Letters, pages upon pages of correspondence. At first, innocent, trade agreements, contracts, polite notes between merchant houses. But as she dug deeper, the tone shifted. Promises, warnings, demands. A letter caught her eye, its wax seal barely holding. She unfolded it carefully, eyes scanning each line. Lord Trenault's hold on the southern routes weakens. The council grows restless. The price is high but the reward is greater. If you wish to see House Valen rise, this is the time. Signed by a noble whose name she recognized, a minor lord with ambitions far beyond his station. There were more, dozens of them. Together they painted a grim portrait. Her father, driven by debts and desperation, had fed information to Corwin's enemies in secret. Trade routes had been seized. Caravans ambushed. Alliances broken. And through it all, House Trenault's fortunes had withered, its influence crumbling beneath unseen sabotage. Lila's breath caught as she found one final note, written in her father's own hand. Forgive me, old friend. I have no choice. The debt is too great. I will do what must be done. May fate be kinder to you than it has been to me. A friend. Her father had once counted Corwin as an ally, perhaps even a friend. And yet he had betrayed him. A deep ache spread through Lila's chest. The man she had admired, had he truly been so trapped? So desperate? Had he meant to destroy, or had he simply believed there was no other way? The more she read, the clearer the picture became. Her father had been ensnared in a web of debts, trapped by powerful rivals. And in seeking to save House Valen, he had condemned House Trenault, and unknowingly condemned his own daughter to this forced marriage. But there was more. Among the papers, a faded journal caught her eye. Its leather cover was worn, the corners frayed. Inside, written in Corwin's steady hand, were his private thoughts. Alaric's betrayal weighs heavy. I could not bring ruin upon his daughter. I could not let her fall with the house. Yet the council demanded reparations. Thus the marriage. A bitter thing, but the only way to shield her from what is to come. Tears blurred Lila's vision. Corwin had known. He had known she was innocent. He had fought to protect her, even as bitterness consumed him. The marriage had been his way to offer her a shield, not a prison. And she had hated him for it. The weight of guilt pressed down on her, mingled with grief and fury. Her father's sins had trapped them both. Corwin's kindness had come too late, buried beneath silence. But now the truth was clear. The web of lies that had ensnared House Trenault, and her own life, was laid bare. She could no longer be the naive girl who had arrived at this cold estate. Too much had changed. Too much had been lost. The dangers Corwin had warned of were real. Rivals would soon descend upon the house like vultures. And if they learned of her father's betrayal, they would destroy her without hesitation. But Lila would not cower. She closed the journal, her hands steady now. The knowledge she held was power, dangerous, yes, but also a weapon. If used wisely, it could shield her. It could give her the leverage she needed to survive what was coming. She would study these papers. Learn every name, every debt, every hidden truth. And when the vultures came, they would not find the weak girl they expected. They would find a woman forged in betrayal, one ready to defend what was hers. She would honor Corwin's final trust. And in doing so, she would carve out a future no one could steal from her again. The carriage wheels hummed softly beneath her as the road unwound, mile after mile, drawing her closer to the place she once called home. But the warmth that had once filled Lila on such journeys was gone, replaced by a cold knot in her chest. She stared out at the passing fields, the familiar landmarks of her childhood now cast in gray. The estate of House Valen rose in the distance, a stately manor perched on the hill, proud and timeless. Yet in her eyes now, it seemed smaller, frilier, a place of illusions long since broken. She carried the truth with her, letters, records, and the journal entries that had unveiled her father's betrayal. They rested in a satchel at her side, their weight heavier than gold. And in her heart, one question echoed with every turn of the wheel. What? When she arrived, the servants met her with surprise. Word of Corwin's death had traveled swiftly, but none had expected her so soon, alone and unescorted. Whispers followed her up the stone steps. She paused in the entry hall, drawing a slow breath. This house, once her refuge, now seemed cold, unfamiliar. Shadows clung to corners. Portraits of ancestors stared down, their painted eyes heavy with judgment. Then came a familiar voice, warm with false joy. "Lila, my child. You have returned." Her father. Alaric Valen emerged from his study, arms open, a practiced smile upon his face. The same face she had loved, trusted, now a mask she could barely endure. She did not return his embrace. Instead, she met his gaze with eyes of iron. "We need to speak," she said quietly. Something in her tone froze him mid-step. He studied her face, sensing the change in her. "In private," she added. Wordlessly, he led her into the study, the very room where, years ago, he had taught her to read and write, where he had whispered bedtime stories. The hearth burned low, casting flickering shadows. Alaric closed the door behind them. "What troubles you, my daughter? You look unwell." She remained standing, her voice steady though her heart pounded. "I have read the ledgers. The letters. Corwin's journal." For a moment, her father's expression flickered, just a heartbeat of surprise, quickly masked. "What nonsense is this?" he replied with forced calm. "You've been misled. The grief of that house has clouded your mind." "No," she said, stronger now. "I know everything. The debts. The information you sold. The ruin you helped cause. And the marriage, your way of binding me to their fall." His face darkened. Gone was the gentle father, the warm storyteller. In his place stood a man hard and calculating. "You speak of matters beyond your understanding," he said coldly. "I did what was necessary. For this house. For you. Would you have us beggars in the street? Would you have me shackled in a dead man's house?" she shot back. "Forced into a marriage born of betrayal?" Alaric's voice rose. "You think the world kind? You think noble blood spares us from ruin?" Corwin was weak. "His house crumbled long before my hand moved. I gave you a place, security. The rest is the way of things." Lila's hands clenched at her sides. "You could have told me. You could have trusted me. Instead, you used me as coin in your schemes." Emotion cracked her voice. The father she had loved was gone, if he had ever truly existed. For a long moment, silence hung between them. Then Alaric spoke, voice lower, more measured. "I did what was needed. For our name. For survival. You will see in time. The world is not ruled by honor, Lila. It is ruled by strength." Her heart ached, torn between love and fury. "I am not your pawn," she whispered. He sighed as if weary of the conversation. "You are my daughter. And the world will know it. You would do well to remember where your loyalty lies." Lila drew herself up, her choice made. "My loyalty is to the truth," she said. "And I will not be part of your lies." Without another word, she turned and left the study, her steps steady, though tears burned in her eyes. The halls of her childhood home closed in around her. Familiar faces stared in shock as she strode past, no longer the wide-eyed girl they had known. She had come seeking answers. She had found only ashes. But now she understood, her path lay forward, not back. Alaric's sins would not define her, nor would they silence her. And as she stepped into the light beyond the manor doors, the chill in her heart gave way to resolve. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it, not as the daughter of a betrayer, but as a woman forged by truth. The grand hall of the high court shimmered with cold marble and colder stairs. Tall arched windows poured pale light onto the nobles gathered below, their silks and furs a sea of restless color. Whispers curled through the air, louder than the herald's calls. Lila stood alone on the long polished floor before the dais, where the lords of the council sat. Above them loomed the great banners of the realm, justice, unity, truth. Today those banners seemed heavy with meaning. She had thought herself prepared. But now, under so many eyes, her heart thundered in her chest. Yet she would not falter. Word had traveled swiftly after her return. Letters she had sent, records she had carefully copied and presented to the council scribes. And though many nobles cared little for the fate of a dying lord or a young woman's forced marriage, the evidence was undeniable. Alaric Valen's betrayal could not be hidden any longer. The council had summoned her, and her father. And now the judgment would come. The court chamber quieted as the herald's voice rang out. Lila Valen, widow of Corwin Trinault, heir of House Trinault, step forth and speak. She stepped forward, chin high, her voice clear though her hands trembled slightly. I am here, she said, and I will speak the truth. A murmur ran through the watching crowd, nobles, merchants, lesser lords, all eager for the scandal unfolding before them. Then came the heavy tread of boots. 2 guards escorted Alaric into the hall. Gone was the proud merchant lord she had known. Her father stood gaunt, eyes shadowed, his fine robes sitting ill upon stooped shoulders. He met her gaze only once and quickly looked away. The council lord at the center, Lord Greythorn, spoke. The charges stand thus, that Alaric Valen, for greed and gain, conspired against House Trinault, feeding secrets to its enemies, hastening its fall, and through deceit, forced his own daughter into an unworthy marriage to mask his crime. Evidence has been submitted. Testimony is called. He turned to Lila. You may speak. The hall grew still. Every noble leaned forward. And Lila began. She told them of the letters, of the debts her father had hidden, of the alliances betrayed. She read aloud from Corwin's journal, voice steady even as grief laced her words. She laid bare the marriage pact, a forced union crafted to shield House Valen from the ruin it had wrought. When she finished, the court was silent. Then Lord Greythorn called upon Alaric. Do you contest these charges? For a moment her father said nothing. Then in a low voice, I did what was needed. For my house. For my blood. He did not look at her. Gasps rose among the lords. Some voices muttered angrily. Others looked at Lila with new respect. Lord Greythorn's voice rang out. There is no honor in such words. The council does not weigh necessity above justice. He turned to the assembled nobles. You have heard the truth. What say you? One by one voices rose. Guilt is clear. Justice must be done. The daughter is blameless. The rights of House Trinault must be restored. At last, the head of the council spoke the judgment. By will of this court, let it be known, Alaric Valen is stripped of title and standing. The Valen estate, by right of restitution, passes to Lila Valen, widow and rightful heiress to House Trinault. Let no one contest this claim. The great hammer fell. The judgment was sealed. Lila stood still, the weight of the moment sinking into her bones. She had won, but at what cost? Her father said nothing as the guards led him away. He did not fight. He did not glance back. And as the nobles filed from the hall, many pausing to bow or offer words of respect, Lila remained standing beneath the high banners. No longer merely a widow. No longer a pawn. But an heiress, and a woman who had faced truth and won. The estate that had once seemed cold and lifeless began at last to breathe again. Lila stood in the great hall of House Trinault, her house now, as beams of late morning light poured through the tall windows. The portraits of the fallen lords looked down not with judgment, but as silent witnesses to a new beginning. Servants bustled through the corridors. The mood had changed. Gone was the heavy air of mourning and decline. In its place, quiet purpose. Lila moved among them, sleeves rolled, skirts brushed with dust, not the distant lady of the manor, but a presence among her people. She listened, asked questions, learned their names and their troubles. Many had long feared for their place here, unsure if House Trinault would survive another season. Now hope flickered anew. She summoned the steward and household council. Together they reviewed the ledgers, not with an eye for old debts and grudges, but to set fair wages, repair the crumbling outer walls, restore trade ties lost to betrayal. Every decision she made was rooted in justice, not pride. And as word spread, the people began to look upon her with new eyes. In the village below the estate, merchants once hesitant now approached the gates with respect. Farmers, hearing of the changes, brought offerings of fresh produce. The blacksmith, whose family had served the house for generations, pledged his skill to the rebuilding. But it was in the faces of the household staff that Lila saw the greatest change, in the cook's warm smile, in the footman's steadier step, in Brea's eyes when they met her own. Lady Trinault, Brea said softly one afternoon as they stood overlooking the gardens, the house lives again. Because of you. Lila's heart swelled, though she kept her voice calm. It is not mine alone. It belongs to all who serve here. She vowed then, silently, fiercely, that she would never again be silenced. Never again a pawn in another's game. The truth she had fought for would guide her steps from this day forward. Corwin's memory lingered in the halls, not as a shadow but as a quiet strength. She often walked the corridors he once paced, speaking softly beneath her breath. I will honor you. I will not fail. And so, Day by day, stone by stone, Lila rebuilt what had been broken. Not just a house, but a purpose. Years passed. The estate flourished under Lila's steady hand. What had once been a cold and crumbling manor now stood strong, a place of warmth and life. The fields beyond the walls were green again, the harvests good. In the village below, stories of the young lady who had stood against betrayal were still told in the quiet corners of taverns and marketplaces. And yet, for all her labors, some things remained unchanged. Each year, on the anniversary of his death, Lila made the same quiet journey. She would rise before dawn and walk alone through the morning mist, along the winding path that led beyond the orchards, past the river bend to a small, peaceful glade. There, beneath the wide boughs of an ancient oak, stood Corwin's grave, marked with simple stone, carved with words of remembrance. In truth, in honor, in peace. Lila would kneel in the soft grass, brushing away fallen leaves. Sometimes she brought fresh flowers. Sometimes only herself. The years had softened her grief but never erased it. Not for the man she had been forced to marry, but for the man she had come to understand in those final days. For the friend he had become when both had been trapped by a web of deceit. She remembered every word of that final night, every whisper he had breathed in the fading moments. Your father, beware, trust the truth, let it rise. Words that had shattered her world, and freed her from it. Now, as the breeze stirred the oak's branches above, Lila would close her eyes and lay her hand gently on the stone. I did not forget, she would murmur. And I will not. She had kept his final whisper close to her heart, through the trials that followed, through the court's judgment, through the long years of rebuilding. It had guided her when doubt crept in. It had reminded her that truth, though buried, could always rise again. And in time, bitterness had faded. In its place, something new had grown, not love born of duty but love of memory, of honor, of shared struggle. A love that asked nothing but gave her strength. There were days when younger lords came calling, seeking her favor. Friends urged her to consider new alliances. But Lila knew her heart. For now her path was her own. And always, when the wind shifted through the glade, she would think, perhaps he heard her still. Perhaps, in some place beyond, he knew. The lady of House Trinault would rise again, brush the dew from her skirts and walk back toward her life, her heart steady, her purpose unshaken. Some truths were meant to endure. And sometimes, love grew where bitterness once bloomed.